Thank you and welcome once again to Beyond Vaudeville.
Check it out. Let's get ready for the announcement.
We're gonna hang the flag.
Hi, welcome to Stairway to Stardom. I'm your host, Frank Massey.
And I'm his co-host, Tilly. Well, we have a good show for you, so you stay tuned to that dial. Frank, why don't you start the show off with a song?
Hey everybody. So, public access TV isn't something that many people think about these days, and it's not exactly difficult to see why. All throughout history, it's slowly been getting a little easier every year for an individual or small group to create something of their own volition and present it to the greater populace. From the invention of the printing press to the advent of newspapers, the rise of radio broadcasting, then television, and eventually the internet. Today, it's remarkably, almost scarily easy for one person to make something and get it out there for everyone to see. I mean, that's kinda what I'm doing right now. So it's easy for a lot of people to forget that it wasn't always this way. Go just 3 decades back and you'll find yourself in an era where one of the only ways to get yourself out there creatively was to find a niche in the entertainment industry, producing books or games or films and so on. But this wasn't exactly the only way. Since the 1970s, public access television has given people a small but viable window through which to project their creative dreams. Granted, it didn't have anything close to the massive reach of national TV, but for many it was just enough. Enough room to produce whatever weird idea they happen to have and send it shimmering over the airwaves to the few who may be looking for it. Quite a lot of hopeful video producers took part, and as such it's really no surprise that a few obscure but remarkable pieces of media were born in this era, although most did eventually end up sinking back into the embrace of anonymity once the era had passed. And in this strange time, there was made a show that seemed to strangely predict massive TV success stories of the future, one that promised at least some degree of notoriety to its viewers, if and only if they were willing to climb the stairway to stardom. Public, educational, and government access television, more specifically just public access, has existed for upwards of 50 years in the United States. From its beginnings as a series of disconnected local networks across the country, public access has always been designed to give at least a small voice to local artists and presenters who would otherwise be overshadowed by large TV stations. For those who don't know, public access essentially functions as a compromise between TV providers and the municipalities they operate in. As mandated by government, in exchange for being allowed to provide service to a region, the provider must allow local broadcasters to use the airways to some degree. This was first mandated by the FCC in 1969 with a loose proclamation that mandated cable systems with 3,500 or more subscribers to carry broadcasts of local presentations, and this was more heavily codified in 1971 and 1984 with the FCC's Third Report and Order and the Cable Act, respectively. But honestly, this isn't too important. What is important is what public access was used for. Very early on, the format gained a reputation for being unpredictable, largely unregulated, and wildly varied, the Wild West of TV broadcasting, as it was, and this reputation was maintained for the next few decades. While many municipalities chose to use their public access capabilities for basic community programming, many others, particularly those with large populations of video makers and artists, went a more individualistic route. Enter New York City. The scene of NYC public broadcasting was wild and diverse, with a number of unique public access shows springing up throughout the 70s and 80s featuring equally unique personalities. Anarchist Coco Crystal, who hosted her own long-running variety show, rock and roll psychiatrist Paul McMahon, who administered treatments on The Live Show before being banned from public access entirely, and pornographer Al Goldstein, who created Midnight Blue, a late-night program that featured, well, you can probably imagine. Among such a bizarre catalog of faces, one might be forgiven for overlooking a 50-year-old retired lounge singer who seemed more on his way out than his way up. but it is with him that our story truly begins. Frank Massey was allegedly born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in the year 1925. Frank was born into an era dominated by big band and swing music, and throughout his formative years he was steeped in the bold sounds of the 1940s, something that would come to define his taste for years to come. Frank's brother was an opera singer, and Frank first appeared on stage at age 10 in a performance of an Italian opera, and show business would become his ultimate passion soon after. Music became of particular interest to him. He performed again on Philadelphia's Horn and Hard Art Children's Hour at age 12, and later on some of his biggest influences would be the era's most noted singers, crooners like Bing Crosby, Billy Eckstine, and Russ Columbo. With this style as his guiding star, Frank Massey pursued his interests throughout the midst of the 20th century, acting as a backup vocalist and performing a series of gigs as a nightclub and lounge singer into the 60s. During one such nightclub show, Frank's piano player bailed at the last minute, and through a new player he was able to sign on, he met a backup vocalist and saxophonist named Evie Day. The two would become a close professional pair from then on, with Evie doing much of Frank's musical arrangements, and Frank putting lyrics and vocals to the melodies. The pair continued to tour a series of hotels, clubs, and various venues as the late 60s ticked on, and eventually, in 1969, Frank would make an outing to New York to cut a record that did moderately well. Although Frank didn't know it at the time, New York is where he would stay for the rest of his life. Frank's arrival in the city coincided with the rise of public access. The FCC had just begun to officially set guidelines, and New York artists were quickly taking advantage of the no-holds-barred, free-form style that public access seemed to promise. And Frank wasn't entirely unaware of this. He lived in the city for a good 10 years, adjusting slowly to the new way of life, and all the while he observed this new form of self-expression, a natural evolution of show business, take form. But the shows and themes currently on NYC Public Access weren't exactly Frank's cup of tea. As previously mentioned, the city's own public access creations tended to be pretty far out there, bizarre, off-kilter, even disturbing at points. These productions were very characteristic of the New York experimental art scene of the time, and as such, public access became a safe haven for underground media not considered network appropriate. In a way, it was a lot like the early days of streaming sites like YouTube. Anyone and everyone doing anything and everything they wanted, with little to no oversight and very little production quality. All this was well and good, but for Frank, who had never really lost his fondness for old-fashioned music and entertainment, it just wasn't the way he wanted to enact his return to showbiz. But that wouldn't be too much of a problem. This was public access, after all, and as long as you had a voice, a camera, and a will to create, anything was possible. Frank Massey made his first foray into the genre in 1979. He teamed up with longtime partner Evie Day to create the Frank Massey Nostalgia Show, alternatively known as The Frank Massey Show: Songs to Remember, broadcast weekly on teleprompter and Manhattan cable. The format of the show was simple and straightforward. Evie would introduce Frank, the show's host, and he would then perform a classic song with their in-house band. Evie would often join in or perform a piece of her own. The show would also bring on a guest performer or two, who he would have perform something from a selected genre, like Broadway show tunes or love ballads. And this seemed to be the medium that Frank and Evie were looking for. They had always wanted to find some way of injecting the music and entertainment of their youths back into the public consciousness, and with the Frank Massey Show, they were finally able to do it in their own small way. Frank was additionally delighted at the prospect of meeting new talent and potentially giving them an avenue to advance their careers by performing on broadcast. Later on, some fans would even send letters into the show requesting specific songs to be sung, and Frank would happily oblige them with a performance. But after about 2 years of running the show, Frank had begun to think seriously about switching things up a bit. He and Evie had seen countless performers come and go in just the short time they'd been running, and Frank was wondering if there wasn't a better way of getting that untapped talent out there for the world, or at least for public access watchers to see. If he could help to further the dream of aspiring artists and breathe new life into show business while he was at it, Frank would have done what he set out to do. And so, in 1981, Stairway to Stardom was officially born. Stairway to Stardom began with a format very similar to that of The Frank Massey Show, with Frank and his wife Tilly as hosts. Backed by their fairly consistent in-house band, a series of performers from a variety of backgrounds would come on the show and do whatever they set out to do. The show was shot in what many thought to be a carpeted basement, but was actually a studio that Frank rented by the hour for production on the show. Stairway had an original theme song performed by Steve Luisi and All the King's Men, and frequently featured special appearances by Evie Day, who did performances, introductions, and other such duties, and guest comedian Don Costello, who did back-and-forth bits with Frank. But the star attractions of Stairway, in many ways quite literally, were the talent that Frank brought on. The recruitment process was done in quite a clever manner. Frank would take out ads in local papers. If you can sing,
dance, do comedy, magic, anything at all, you can appear on Stairway to Stardom.
Frequent patrons of the show and newcomers alike would see these ads and, if they felt confident enough, reach out to Frank to arrange an audition. Frank would screen each contestant and eventually select around 4 to perform on the next episode of Stairway. While musical acts dominated initially, as the show went on, a far greater variety of performances would begin to be seen. And through it all, Frank never charged his contestants to appear on the show. Demanding payment just didn't sit right with him, and for the entirety of the show's run, contestants appeared for no charge at all. And contestants is probably the best word for the show's performers, as Stairway played out largely like a TV talent show. Now, if this sounds familiar to you, it's likely because this is something that's been a staple of the TV industry for upwards of 30 years at this point. Shows like American Idol, The Voice, and America's Got Talent make it seem like this has always been a popular style. But what makes Stairway to Stardom so fascinating is that it predates all of these shows by quite a lot. Even Star Search, widely considered the first mainstream TV talent show, began airing in 1983, a full 2 years after Stairway, and Frank insisted well into the 90s that the show may have gotten a good deal of inspiration from Stairway as well. Regardless of whether or not it did, the fact that Stairway did what it did all the way back in the early 80s makes it a pioneer if nothing else, even if it wasn't recognized for its uniqueness at the time. But that didn't really matter. As long as the contestants continued to try out for the show and continued to perform their various acts, Frank Massey would keep Stairway running. The acts featured by the show were, to put it lightly, all over the place. A surprisingly large portion of the acts were of high quality, well-choreographed dance routines, remarkably competent musical acts, and some overall quite passionate performances. Of course, there were a good deal of bad acts as well. Kids who had absolutely no idea what they were doing, ensemble singing groups that couldn't quite keep in time with the music, and poorly paced comedians whose routines were made even less funny by the dead silence of the Stairway recording studio. In between those two extremes were acts that were just okay, as was probably expected from the lower production quality of the show. Joey Marlowe, who couldn't decide whether to sing or dance, so he just did both of them about half as well. Jerry Callahan, who performed birthday party level magic tricks for about 3 minutes. Johnny Gallagher, who did impressions that sorta kinda sounded like who they were supposed to sound like, if you turned your head just right. And this was honestly part of the show's charm. These weren't professionals or industry veterans, they were just ordinary people, like everyone else watching them perform. And whether they were good or bad, they had the unique effect of making watchers think, hey, I could do that. Many of the contestants on Stairway came on the show to demonstrate their original choreography or music that they'd personally written, and many saw it as a perfect avenue through which to express their creative dreams, creating even more of a draw that continued to bring contestants onto the show. And this original rough-around-the-edges charm, along with the show's unique decor and camera/effect work that bordered on psychotic, made Stairway to Stardom something unique and almost timeless that could be enjoyed just as much in 1982 as in 2022. But if I'm being honest, these ordinary acts weren't even the best part. Of course, singing, dancing, and musical performances were staples of the broadcasts, but the looser, more chaotic nature of public access meant that the weirder acts that normally wouldn't fly on mainstream TV were completely accepted. You had people doing really creepy ventriloquist acts with puppets that looked disturbingly similar to them, and then other puppet shows that were slightly less creepy but also just kinda sucked. There were belly dancers and tap dancers, and dancers who performed their routines in what looked like a dark room. There were these two women sharing a cloak, singing a song about Dracula, I think. There was a hip-hop act about 5 years behind its time with a frontman wearing an orange balaclava rapping about crackheads. You had Precious Taft delivering a nigh incomprehensible monologue before breaking into tears over the course of a minute. Sometimes contestants would put viewers to sleep with their acts. Sometimes they looked like they were about to fall asleep during their acts. These acts could be good, they could be bad, they could be straight up confusing at points. Gloria Huddle's bizarre performance of the Manhattan Transfer's operator was equal parts astounding and surreal, to the point that it almost seemed fake. But what made Stairway special is that it really was all genuine. The performers who appeared on the show seemed simultaneously like ordinary people you could encounter without a second look, and strange, larger-than-life characters that you could never quite believe were real. And Frank Massey took them all in stride, welcoming each contestant warmly onto the show and letting them give it their all, no matter how weird or unusual. In his own words, Frank really just wanted to help people. If he, Evie, Tilly, Don, and the rest of the show's meager crew could give their would-be stars the push that they needed, they were more than happy to do it. The show continued throughout the entirety of the 80s, becoming about as recognizable as a public access show in NYC could be. Frank earned almost nothing from it, and paid for the studio and equipment largely out of his own pocket. And unfortunately, this would not be as sustainable as many would hope. The late 1980s saw the landscape of TV become more tumultuous than at almost any point in recent memory. Broadcast hijackings like Captain Midnight and the Max Headroom incident showed viewers that television networks were not as infallible as was once thought, and the rise of decidedly more risque programming triggered backlash from a subset of the population. Into the early 1990s, public opinion began to turn against public access TV, citing its lack of regulation and potential for dangerous or harmful content as reasons for public access reform, and understandably so. But unfortunately, this coincided with Frank Massey's realization that the ever-mounting costs of keeping Stairway running, close to $350 a session, were simply not tenable. It had been a good run, and the show certainly wasn't running short on contestants, but its hosts were getting on in years, and had been unable to find sponsors. The no-charge business model Frank had established certainly didn't help with this either. And so, Frank officially decided that Stairway to Stardom had come to an end. The show ran its final episode in 1992, starring guests Gia Williams along with Earl Lewis and the Channels, who performed a lively final song to send off 11 years of Stairway and a few more years of The Frank Massey Show. And with that, the show had concluded. Unfortunately, despite its cult popularity, Stairway had never managed to bridge the gap between public access and mainstream TV, like its New York contemporary Beyond Vaudeville. Despite its impressive runtime and the magnificent acts it hosted, Stairway ended in '92 just about where it had started, with a few final unique acts and an enthusiastic goodbye from its beloved hosts. And normally this would be where our story ends. Stairway would have likely gone the way of thousands of other contemporary public access shows, forgotten by all but a few, largely lost and hopelessly obscure. But a man named Mitch Friedman was determined not to let this happen. Mitch first heard about the show from a friend around 1990, towards the end of the show's run. He tuned in one late night to NYC Public Access and just so happened to come upon what many consider one of the show's finest episodes, starring Don Costello failing to lip-sync to Menomina, Al Villa performing a Red Fox comedy routine pretty much word for word, and one Lucille Cataldo performing her own original song Hairdresser, which stretched about 30 seconds of lyrics into 4 minutes. From this very first episode, Mitch was hooked, and along with a friend named Doug Miller, he eagerly awaited each new installment of Stairway. So you can imagine their surprise when, one night in 1992, no new episode appeared on screen. The show had been suddenly and abruptly taken off the air, leaving what was, for many people, a void that would be hard to fill. But unlike most others, Mitch was going to take action. Finding Frank Massey wasn't actually difficult at all, as Frank featured his phone number at the end of every Stairway episode, and upon calling, Frank eagerly invited Mitch and Doug to his Brooklyn residence. The pair were welcomed into Frank's home and were able to get an hour-long interview with him, the only one known to exist. At this point, eager to get any information they could on Stairway, Mitch and Doug told Frank that they were producing a documentary on public access and requested any show tapes he may have had. And it was likely this singular action saved Stairway from perpetual obscurity. Frank happily provided close to 40 episodes of Stairway, a far cry from the 100 or so that were actually produced, but still far more than anyone likely had recorded in the show's 11-year run. Still under the guise of documentary production, Mitch copied all the tapes and stored them for posterity before returning the masters to Frank and bidding him farewell with $100 and an order of cannolis as thanks, which Frank reportedly accepted enthusiastically. And this likely would be the last time Frank was contacted for anything Stairway related for the rest of his life. Frank lived out his last years peacefully in his New York home with his wife Tilly and his family until passing away in 2013, at the age of 88. During this time, he was reported to have made contact with many of the contestants and crew from the show and established lasting friendships with them. But while Frank Massey may not have been around any longer, his legacy certainly was.
On the Stairway to Stardom.
Mitch became known as the de facto expert on Stairway to Stardom in the years following, eventually establishing a YouTube channel where he regularly uploads material from the tapes given to him by Frank. In doing so, he has almost single-handedly preserved an incredibly unique cultural time capsule in the form of Stairway's myriad performances. Saving the episodes from obscurity has allowed us to take a rare glimpse into a work of passion that was in many ways ahead of its time, and in many others deeply rooted in the past. Not only was the show a trailblazer of sorts in the format it chose to pursue, but a representation of the truest spirit of public access and community-driven media in general. It was a place where anyone and everyone could gather to show off whatever it was they had to show, no matter how far out it happened to be. These days, it's relatively straightforward to make a start into getting yourself out there. While it's not easy by any means, and it takes a great deal of luck and skill, thanks to the advent of the internet, we all have a stairway of sorts if we choose to climb it. Whether it leads to stardom is anyone's guess, but at the very least we have a place to start. This is what Frank Massey's show, and public access in general, was to the artists and creators of the TV era. An opportunity, if only a small one, to get themselves out there in a world determined to see that they didn't. An opening through which they could see the success and recognition they had always dreamed of. A door to a land both entirely unknown and boundlessly exciting. Frank Massey and the Stairway crew may never have stepped through that door themselves, but they were more than happy to hold it open for others. Thanks for watching.
You see tomorrow starts today on the Stairway to Stardom. We're here to brighten up your day. We've got singers and dancers and actors performing for you.